It's something a lot of us feel, but we rarely ever actually say it out loud. Have you ever noticed how some of us fall the hardest for the people who give us the absolute least amount of emotional certainty? Not the ones who love openly, but the ones who feel just out of reach, unpredictable, distant. Tonight, we're going to explore why that is, why for so many of us, the less available someone becomes, the deeper our feelings actually seem to grow. So why do we do this? Why do we mistake that cold distance for something profound? Now, to be clear, this isn't about pointing fingers or blaming someone else for being distant, not at all. This is an inward look. It's an exploration into our own loneliness, our core sense of self-worth, and that deep childhood conditioning that taught us, somewhere along the way, that love is something you have to earn through suffering. Which brings us to our first layer, the thrill of uncertainty. Look, a healthy connection is grounded, it's peaceful. But when affection is inconsistent, well, you stop experiencing the relationship as a safe harbor. Instead, you're basically sitting at a slot machine. You're waiting for those texts, you're analyzing every hour of silence. Every tiny emotional shift becomes this high-stakes gamble. And slowly, almost without you noticing, what you thought was just attraction mutates into this agonizing addiction to the chase. And there's a deep biological reason for this. Our nervous system absolutely craves resolution. When you're constantly kept off balance, your brain starts treating this inconsistent love like a really powerful reward system. You aren't necessarily addicted to the person themselves. Your nervous system is just addicted to that sudden spike of relief that finally hits when the uncertainty resolves. And just like that, attraction turns into a deep, deep dependency. Let's go a little deeper into the echoes of childhood. For a lot of us, love growing up came with a pretty heavy set of invisible strings. Maybe affection in your house was strictly tied to your achievements. Maybe your emotional vulnerability was ignored, or the warmth was just unpredictable. Without you even realizing it, your nervous system absorbed a really silent, really dangerous lesson. That love is not a given, it's a prize, and it has to be earned. There's a profound truth here. Emotional distance reminds the body of old emotional environments. When you cross paths with an emotionally unavailable partner later in life, they feel strangely familiar. Not safe, exactly, but familiar. So when they finally do show you a scrap of affection, it feels incredibly rewarding because for just a fleeting second, it temporarily patches a very old, very deep emotional wound. But we have to realize that longing and love are not always the same thing. It is so incredibly easy to mistake an emotional struggle for a genuine connection. The pain of the chase, it feels meaningful. It feels cinematic, even. But the quiet truth we eventually have to face is that this heavy, agonizing longing, it's fundamentally different from actual love. Now, let's look at part 3, the ego's need. This is the hidden, painful thought for so many of us. If I can just make her love me, maybe I'm finally enough. For a guy caught in this cycle, the relationship actually stops being about genuinely connecting with another human being. Without him even knowing it, it becomes this desperate, exhausting attempt to prove his own worth to himself. And that's when the downward spiral really begins. First, you overgive, pouring all your energy into a void. Then, you start overthinking every single interaction, analyzing every word, every look, every silence. Ultimately, you just lose your center entirely. It's this agonizing process of self-abandonment, trying to wring emotional security out of someone who simply cannot provide it.
And when that happens, love just becomes survival. It's no longer a connection. Because when your entire sense of self-worth is hanging by a thread, depending completely on someone else finally turning around and choosing you, you aren't really in a relationship anymore. You're just in a state of emotional survival.
Which leads us to part 4, the paradox of why peace feels boring. You see, healthy love is consistent. It's predictable. It's safe. But here's the massive catch. If you grew up associating love with anxiety and distance, this kind of peace actually feels physically uncomfortable. To a nervous system that's been hardwired for the chase, stability feels way too quiet. Honestly, it just feels boring. But emotional intensity is not always intimacy. And that's a really hard realization to sit with late at night. What feels like this intense, undeniable passion, it's sometimes just unresolved pain in a really good disguise. Because stability feels so unfamiliar, we'll unconsciously sabotage calm, healthy relationships. We chase the chaos, because for a while, chaos is the only thing that actually makes us feel emotionally alive. So, How do we break the pattern? Part 5, Awakening and Real Healing. The entire shift begins with the questions we're asking ourselves. You have to stop asking, how do I make them love me? That question is entirely rooted in anxiety and a desperate need for control. Instead, you have to ask a much braver question. Why does this emotional unavailability feel attractive to me in the first place? That is where true, life-changing introspection actually begins. Because the reality is, love should never feel like emotional starvation. True intimacy simply cannot take root and grow in soil where emotional safety doesn't exist. The realization we all have to come to is that being deeply understood by someone is vastly more valuable and so much more nourishing than constantly being chased or doing the chasing. The goal here isn't to stop loving deeply. It's just to stop confusing suffering with love. The true foundation of real love is presence. It's consistency, safety, emotional honesty. A real connection won't ever force you to constantly perform for a scrap of affection. It will never make you question your fundamental worth. And it certainly won't leave you emotionally starving while trying to call it romance. So, I'll leave you with this question tonight. Have you ever mistaken emotional intensity for genuine love? Just take a moment and sit with that. Because sometimes, the absolute deepest act of self-respect is simply choosing to no longer chase people who only know how to love you from a distance.